Frank Miller wiped the sweat from his brow as the afternoon sun beat down on his weathered skin. At 58, his body carried the aches and pains of decades working the land, but today, something felt different. He paused by the fence, watching his prized mare Whisper grazing peacefully in the distance. There was something special about that horse, something he couldn't quite explain to folks who weren't animal people. The way she looked at him sometimes, it was almost like she understood every word he said. Frank had bought Whisper 7 years ago from a neglectful owner who'd kept her tied up in a small pen, underfed and mistreated. The mare had been skittish then, her ribs visible beneath her dull coat. But patience and kindness had transformed her into a magnificent animal with a chestnut coat that gleamed in the sunlight and eyes that seemed too knowing for a horse. "Come on, girl," he called, walking toward the barn with a bucket of feed. Whisper lifted her head, ears perked, and trotted over with a grace that still amazed him. He set the bucket down and stroked her neck as she ate. "That's my good girl." The quiet life on his small farm outside of Millfield suited Frank just fine. Since losing his wife Margaret to cancer 5 years ago, he'd found solace in routine. Up at dawn, tend to the animals, work the fields, repair what needed fixing, then sit on the porch with a cold beer as the sun set. His daughter Sarah visited when she could, though less frequently since her marriage had fallen apart last year. The miscarriage that followed had nearly broken her, and Frank worried about the darkness that had settled in her eyes. As dusk approached, Frank finished his chores and headed to the house. He'd just set foot on the porch when he heard Whisper neighing loudly from the paddock. Turning, he saw her pacing restlessly along the fence, tossing her head. "What's got into you?" he muttered, setting down his tools and walking back toward her. This wasn't like Whisper at all. She was usually calm as still water, especially in the evenings. The mare continued to whinny, pressing against the gate and looking toward the road that ran along the eastern edge of Frank's property. Her behavior was so unusual that Frank felt a prickle of concern. He opened the gate, and Whisper immediately pushed past him, trotting a few paces before looking back as if waiting for him to follow. "All right, I'm coming," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the tool shed. The sun was setting rapidly now, casting long shadows across the fields. Whisper led him toward the road, occasionally stopping to make sure he was still following. Frank had never seen anything like it. It was almost as if she was trying to show him something. As they approached the road, Whisper's pace quickened. She headed straight for a cluster of overgrown bushes near the ditch, where people sometimes illegally dumped their trash. Frank cursed under his breath. He'd complained to the county about it more times than he could count, but nothing ever changed. Whisper stopped abruptly at the edge of the ditch, pawing at the ground and snorting. Frank shone his flashlight over the area, expecting to find a wounded animal or maybe another horse. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. Among the scattered garbage and discarded fast food containers was a large black trash bag, partially torn open, and from within that tear, a tiny human hand protruded. "Dear God," Frank whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled down into the ditch, nearly losing his footing on the slippery slope. Whisper whinnied anxiously from above. With trembling hands, Frank tore open the bag wider. Inside, wrapped in a blood-stained towel, was a newborn baby. The infant's skin was pale with a bluish tint that made Frank's stomach clench in fear. For a terrible moment, he thought he was too late. Then the baby moved, just slightly, and Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Alive. The baby was alive. He gently lifted the tiny form from the bag, cradling it against his chest. It was a girl, he realized. So small she couldn't be more than a few hours old. The umbilical cord had been cut roughly, tied off with what looked like a shoelace. She wasn't crying. Was that normal? Frank didn't know much about babies. Whisper had made her way down into the ditch and now stood beside him, her warm breath ghosting over the infant. The mare lowered her head gently, nudging Frank's arm as if checking on the baby. "You found her," Frank said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You knew she was here." Frank's mind raced. He needed to get the baby warm, get her to a hospital. but the nearest one was in Millfield, 20 minutes away. His truck was back at the house. He looked at the baby's pale face and made a decision. "Come on, girl," he said to Whisper, carefully climbing back up to the road with the infant secure in one arm. "We need to hurry." Whisper seemed to understand the urgency. She knelt down on her front legs, lowering herself in a way Frank had never seen her do before, making it easier for him to climb onto her back while holding the baby. Once he was seated, she rose carefully and set off at a quick but smooth pace toward the farmhouse. The ride back seemed to take forever. Frank kept his eyes on the tiny bundle in his arms, whispering words of encouragement, though he wasn't sure the baby could hear him. She was so still, so quiet. Only the slight rise and fall of her chest told him she was hanging on. When they reached the house, Frank slid off Whisper's back, murmuring thanks to the mare before rushing inside. He laid the baby on the kitchen table and quickly grabbed the phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "Emergency services. What's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. "I found a baby," Frank said, his words tumbling out. "Abandoned in a trash bag by the road. She's alive but not crying. She needs help." As he gave the operator his address and answered her questions, Frank wrapped the baby in a clean dish towel, trying to warm her tiny body. Outside, he could hear Whisper neighing, still agitated. "An ambulance is on its way, sir," the operator assured him. "They should be there in about 15 minutes. In the meantime, I need you to keep the baby warm. Do you have a blanket?" Frank grabbed a soft blanket from the living room and gently wrapped it around the infant. As he held her close to his chest, he felt a strange tightening in his throat. Who could do this to a baby? Who could throw away a life like it was nothing more than garbage? The baby stirred in his arms, her tiny face scrunching up. Then, finally, she began to cry, a weak, pitiful sound that nevertheless filled Frank with relief. Crying meant breathing. Crying meant fighting. "That's it," he encouraged, rocking her gently. "You cry all you want, little one. Help is coming." Outside, Whisper had gone quiet. Frank moved to the window and saw her standing perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the house as if keeping watch. In that moment, Frank felt a connection between them that transcended the usual bond between man and animal. Somehow this horse had known exactly what to do, had led him to a dying baby who would have had no chance otherwise. As the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, Frank looked down at the tiny life in his arms. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, hoping with all his heart that it was true. "Whisper found you for a reason." Little did Frank know that this moment, this rescue on an ordinary evening, would change his life forever. The story of a horse saving an abandoned baby was just beginning, and what would happen next would shock everyone in Millfield and beyond. The ambulance arrived in a flurry of flashing lights and urgent voices. 2 paramedics rushed in, their expressions shifting from professional urgency to stunned disbelief as Frank explained how he'd found the baby. They worked quickly, checking the infant's vitals and wrapping her in specialized thermal blankets before placing her in a portable incubator. "Her body temperature is dangerously low," the female paramedic explained as she inserted an IV line into the baby's tiny arm. "And she's showing signs of dehydration. It's a miracle she's alive." "Will she make it?" Frank asked, his voice hoarse. The paramedic's eyes softened. "She's got a chance, thanks to you, and your horse." She smiled briefly before returning to her work. "The doctor will want to talk to you. And the police, too." Frank nodded, watching as they carefully carried the incubator to the ambulance. He felt strangely reluctant to let the baby go, even though he knew she needed medical care he couldn't provide. After grabbing his jacket, he stepped outside and found Whisper still standing at attention near the porch. He approached her, stroking her neck gratefully. "You did good, girl. Real good." He pressed his forehead briefly against hers. "I need to go with them now. I'll be back soon." The mare nickered softly, as if in understanding. Frank made sure her water trough was full and that she had enough feed for the night before climbing into his truck to follow the ambulance to Millfield General Hospital. The emergency room was chaos. A car accident had brought in multiple trauma cases just before Frank arrived. He sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area, his farmer's cap clutched in his weathered hands, watching the blur of medical personnel rushing past. It was nearly midnight when a doctor finally approached him. "Mr. Miller, I'm Dr. Abernathy. I understand you're the one who found the infant?" Frank stood up, suddenly aware of his mud-stained jeans and the smell of horse that clung to him. "Yes, ma'am. My horse found her, really." "How is she?" The doctor gestured for him to sit back down and took the chair beside him. "She's stabilized, which is remarkable given her condition when she arrived. We estimate she's less than 6 hours old, born without medical assistance, and left exposed for at least a couple of hours." Frank felt sick at the thought. "But she'll recover?" "We're cautiously optimistic. She's responding well to treatment, though she's still at risk for complications like infection or respiratory issues." Dr. Abernathy hesitated. "Mr. Miller, the police are here. They'll want to take your statement and begin investigating. This is a case of attempted infanticide." The word hit Frank like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately left that baby to die. He nodded grimly. "I'll tell them everything I know." The officers who interviewed Frank were thorough, taking detailed notes about where and how he'd found the baby. They seemed particularly interested in Whisper's behavior. "You're saying your horse led you directly to the baby?" the older officer asked skeptically. "That's exactly what I'm saying. Whisper knew something was wrong. She wouldn't settle down until I followed her." The younger officer looked impressed. "Animals have instincts we don't understand sometimes. My grandpa had a dog that could sense when people were sick before they even knew it themselves." After finishing their questions, the officers informed Frank that they would be searching the area where the baby was found for evidence and canvassing local hospitals and clinics for any information about a woman who might have recently given birth without being admitted afterward. "We'll also need your permission to access your property to examine the scene," the older officer added. "Of course," Frank agreed. "Whatever helps find who did this." It was nearly 3 a.m. when Frank was finally allowed to see the baby. A kind-faced nurse led him to the neonatal intensive care unit, where the infant lay in an incubator, tubes and wires connecting her tiny body to various machines that beeped steadily. She looked even smaller than Frank remembered, her skin still pale but no longer that frightening bluish color. "She's a fighter," the nurse said softly. 6 pounds, 3 ounces. No name yet, of course. Frank gazed at the baby through the clear plastic of the incubator. Her eyes were closed, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Despite the clinical surroundings, despite the circumstances, something about her called to him. "Can I touch her?" he asked. The nurse nodded. "There's an opening on the side. Just be gentle." Frank carefully slipped his hand through the port in the side of the incubator. His weathered finger looked enormous next to the baby's miniature hand, but when he gently touched her palm, her fingers reflexively curled around his in a grip that belied her fragile appearance. Something shifted in Frank's chest, a protective instinct so fierce it took his breath away. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "You're a strong one, aren't you?" "A social worker will be assigned to her case," the nurse explained. "Once she's medically stable, she'll likely be placed in emergency foster care while they search for relatives." Frank nodded, but his eyes never left the baby's face. "What happens if they don't find anyone?" "Then she'll remain in the foster system until a more permanent placement can be arranged, possibly adoption." Frank thought of Sarah then, of the nursery in her apartment that still sat untouched since the miscarriage, of the hollowness in her eyes. Before he could stop himself, he said, "My daughter, she lost a baby last year. She's been hurting something awful." The nurse gave him a sympathetic look. "That's terribly hard. I'm sorry for your family's loss. Would it be possible for her to maybe foster this little one? Once she's well enough to leave the hospital, I mean." The words surprised Frank even as he spoke them. "That would be up to Child Protective Services," the nurse explained gently. "But if your daughter is interested, she could contact them about becoming a foster parent. It's not a quick process, though. There are home studies, Background checks? Frank nodded, already thinking about how to broach the subject with Sarah. She'd been so broken after losing her baby at 6 months pregnant, then having her husband walk out when her grief became too much for him to handle. Could this tiny abandoned child be the miracle that brought his daughter back from the edge of despair? Or would suggesting it only reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal? The baby stirred in her incubator, her tiny face scrunching up before relaxing again. Frank gently withdrew his finger from her grip. "You rest now, little one. Get strong." As he left the hospital in the pale light of early morning, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been irrevocably changed. He drove back to his farm in a daze, the events of the night replaying in his mind. When he pulled into his driveway, he was surprised to see Whisper standing at the fence, as if she'd been waiting for his return. He approached her slowly, fatigue weighing down his steps. "She's hanging in there, girl," he told the mare, who lowered her head to nuzzle his hand. "That baby's got a fighting spirit, like you." As Frank finally made his way to his bedroom, he knew sleep would be elusive. His mind was too full of the tiny baby fighting for her life in the hospital and of his daughter, fighting a different kind of battle across town. He picked up his phone and stared at it, wondering if it was too early to call Sarah. Something told him this couldn't wait. Some news changed everything, and this was that kind of news. With a deep breath, he dialed his daughter's number, listening to it ring as the sun began to climb higher in the sky, casting long shadows across his farm and illuminating Whisper, who remained at the fence, her gaze fixed on the road as if standing sentinel against further harm. Sarah Miller arrived at her father's farm just after noon, her car kicking up dust as it sped down the long driveway. Frank was waiting on the porch, 2 cups of coffee steaming on the small table beside him. He stood as she approached, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her clothes hung loosely on her once fuller frame. At 32, she looked older than her years, grief having carved new lines around her mouth and between her brows. "Dad," she said, embracing him briefly before pulling back to search his face. "What's going on? You sounded so strange on the phone." Frank gestured to the chair across from his. "Sit down, honey. I've got quite a story to tell you." As Sarah sipped her coffee, Frank recounted the events of the previous night. Whisper's unusual behavior, the discovery of the abandoned infant, the frantic ride to the hospital. Sarah's eyes widened as he spoke, her hands tightening around her mug. "Is the baby okay?" she asked when he finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's holding on. The doctors are cautiously optimistic." Sarah set down her mug and stood abruptly, walking to the porch railing to stare out at the fields where Whisper was grazing. Frank watched her back, the slight tremor in her shoulders telling him she was fighting for composure. "Why did you call me, Dad?" she finally asked, still facing away from him. "Why tell me this story?" Frank took a deep breath. "Because I thought you should know. Because that little girl needs someone. And because I saw how you were with Whisper when I first brought her home, broken and scared as she was. You have a way with the wounded ones, Sarah." Sarah turned to face him then, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You think I should foster her? After everything?" Her voice broke on the last word. "I think you should meet her," Frank said gently. "See how you feel then." Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand, a gesture so reminiscent of her childhood that Frank's heart ached. "I don't know if I can, Dad. What if I get attached and then they find her mother, or some relative claims her? I can't lose another baby." "That's a risk, sure enough," Frank acknowledged. "But sometimes the biggest risks bring the greatest rewards. Besides, that little girl deserves someone who'll love her like she's their own, even if it's just for a little while." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll go see her. That's all I'm promising right now." "That's all I'm asking," Frank said, relief washing over him. Before they left for the hospital, Sarah insisted on seeing Whisper. The mare trotted over as soon as she saw them approaching the fence, her ears perked forward with interest. "Hey, beautiful girl," Sarah murmured, stroking the horse's velvety nose. "Dad says you're a hero." Whisper nickered softly, pushing her head against Sarah's hand. Frank watched the interaction with a smile, remembering how Sarah had spent hours with Whisper in the early days, just sitting in the paddock, reading aloud from her favorite books while the traumatized horse gradually learned to trust again. "She looks good," Sarah said, her voice warmer than it had been in months. "Happy." "She is," Frank agreed. "But she's been acting different since last night, more alert, like she's waiting for something." Sarah gave him a curious look. "What do you think she's waiting for?" Frank shrugged. "Can't say for sure. But if I had to guess, I'd say she's waiting to hear about that baby." The drive to Millfield General was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Frank led Sarah through the now familiar hallways to the NICU, where Dr. Abernathy was examining the baby. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him with a tired smile. "I was just about to call you. We've had some developments." Frank introduced Sarah, explaining that she was his daughter. Dr. Abernathy's expression softened with understanding. "The baby is doing remarkably well," she told them. "Her body temperature has normalized, and she's taking formula. We're still monitoring her closely, but she's definitely a fighter." "Has anyone come forward?" Frank asked, his voice low. "Any word on the mother?" Dr. Abernathy shook her head. "Not yet. The police are investigating, but so far no leads. A social worker has been assigned to the case. She'll be here shortly to discuss next steps." Sarah had moved to the incubator, her eyes fixed on the tiny infant inside. The baby was awake, her dark blue eyes seeming to stare right back at Sarah. Without the urgent tubes and wires from the night before, she looked less fragile, though still impossibly small. "Can I hold her?" Sarah asked suddenly, turning to the doctor. Dr. Abernathy hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, let me help you." Frank watched as the doctor carefully lifted the baby from the incubator and placed her in Sarah's arms, showing her how to support the tiny head. Something shifted in Sarah's expression as she cradled the infant. A softening, awakening. The baby gazed up at her with that solemn, unfocused stare of newborns, and Sarah's lips curved into the first genuine smile Frank had seen from her in months. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "You've had quite an adventure, haven't you?" The baby's tiny hand escaped from the blanket, and Sarah offered her finger, which the infant gripped with surprising strength. Frank felt his throat tighten at the sight. "She needs a name," Dr. Abernathy said. "Even a temporary one for the records." Sarah didn't look up from the baby's face. "Lily," she said softly. "She looks like a lily to me." "Lily Jane," Frank added, thinking of his late wife. "If that's okay with you, Sarah." Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Lily Jane. It's perfect." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a brisk, professional-looking woman who introduced herself as Ms. Harmon from Child Protective Services. She explained that she would be handling Lily's case and asked to speak with Frank privately about the circumstances of finding the baby. While they spoke in the hallway, Sarah remained with Lily, rocking her gently and speaking in hushed tones that Frank couldn't quite make out. He answered Ms. Harmon's questions honestly, including his hope that Sarah might be considered as a foster placement. "Your daughter would need to apply and be vetted like any potential foster parent," Ms. Harmon explained. "The process normally takes several months, including home studies and background checks. However, given the circumstances and the baby's needs, we might be able to expedite things somewhat." "Sarah's a good person," Frank said earnestly. "She's had a rough year, but she's strong, and she already loves that baby. I can see it." Ms. Harmon's expression remained neutral. "Love is important, Mr. Miller, but so is stability. We'll need to assess your daughter's living situation, emotional state, and ability to provide for an infant before making any decisions." When they returned to the NICU, Sarah was singing softly to Lily, a lullaby that Margaret had once sung to Sarah herself. The sight made Frank's chest tighten with a complex mixture of grief and hope. Ms. Harmon approached Sarah, introducing herself and explaining the situation. "The baby, Lily, will need to be placed in foster care once she's medically cleared to leave the hospital, which could be as soon as tomorrow if she continues to improve." "I want to foster her," Sarah said immediately, her arms tightening protectively around the infant. Ms. Harmon's expression remained professional. "I understand your interest, Ms. Miller. Your father mentioned it as well. If you're serious about this, we can begin the application process today. However, I should warn you that even with expedited procedures, we may need to place Lily in a temporary certified foster home while your application is processed." Sarah's face fell, but she nodded in understanding. "What do I need to do?" As Ms. Harmon outlined the steps and handed Sarah various forms to complete, Frank noticed how his daughter's demeanor had changed in just the short time since they'd arrived. There was a new determination in her eyes, a purpose that had been missing since her miscarriage. "I'll help you with whatever you need," he promised, when Ms. Harmon stepped away to make a phone call. "We'll get the nursery ready again, buy whatever supplies she needs." Sarah gave him a tremulous smile. "I'm scared, Dad. What if they don't approve me? What if they find her mother and she wants her back? What if—" "One step at a time," Frank interrupted gently. "For now, let's just focus on getting you approved as a foster parent. We'll handle the rest as it comes." Sarah nodded, looking back down at Lily, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "She's so perfect," she whispered. "I can't believe someone just threw her away like trash." Frank's jaw tightened at the reminder. People do terrible things sometimes, but she's safe now, and that's what matters. As they left the hospital several hours later, after completing initial paperwork and scheduling a home inspection for the following day, Sarah paused in the parking lot. "I want to thank Whisper," she said suddenly. "Is that crazy?" Frank smiled. "Not crazy at all. I think she'd like that." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah took emergency leave from her job as a high school English teacher to prepare for Lily's arrival and navigate the complex foster care application process. Frank helped her clean and repaint the nursery in her small two-bedroom house, carefully bringing the baby furniture out of storage. Neither of them mentioned the tiny clothes and toys that Sarah had bought for the baby she'd lost, but Frank noticed how his daughter's hands trembled when she opened the closet where they'd been packed away. "We can buy new things if this is too hard," he offered gently. Sarah shook her head, pulling out a soft yellow blanket with embroidered butterflies. "No, I want to use these. They should be loved by a baby, not hidden away in boxes." Meanwhile, Lily continued to thrive at the hospital. Each day, Sarah spent hours at her side, holding her, feeding her, changing her diapers under the watchful eyes of the nurses, who were growing increasingly fond of both the abandoned baby and her potential foster mother. Dr. Abernathy had become an unexpected ally, writing a strong letter of support for Sarah's application to become Lily's foster parent. "In my professional opinion," she'd written, "the bond forming between Ms. Miller and this infant is exactly the kind of attachment that leads to optimal development." On the fourth day after Lily's discovery, Ms. Harmon arrived at the hospital with news. Sarah and Frank had just finished giving Lily her afternoon bottle when the social worker entered the room, her expression unreadable. "We've expedited your application, Ms. Miller," she announced. "Given the circumstances and the strong recommendations from Dr. Abernathy and your employer, we're prepared to grant you emergency foster parent status." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. "Really? When can I take her home?" "As soon as Dr. Abernathy gives medical clearance. Possibly tomorrow." Ms. Harmon's professional demeanor softened slightly. "This is still temporary, you understand. The police investigation is ongoing, and if the mother or other family members are identified, reunification would be the priority." Sarah nodded, though Frank could see the conflict in her eyes. "I understand. I just want what's best for Lily." "There's something else you should know," Ms. Harmon continued, checking her notes. "The police found evidence at the scene, a receipt from a convenience store about 30 miles from here. Security footage shows a very pregnant young woman making a purchase there the morning Lily was born. They're working on identifying her now." The news hit Frank like a punch to the gut. He'd been so focused on Lily and Sarah that he'd almost forgotten about the person who had abandoned the baby in the first place. Almost, but not quite. The image of that tiny hand protruding from a garbage bag still haunted his dreams. "What will happen to her?" he asked. "The mother, I mean. If they find her. Ms. Harmon's expression grew grave. She'll face serious charges: attempted infanticide, child abandonment, child endangerment. She could be looking at significant prison time. Sarah looked troubled. She must have been desperate to do something like that. That's no excuse, Frank said, more sharply than he'd intended. She left that baby to die. If it weren't for Whisper. He broke off, shaking his head. Ms. Harmon glanced between them. These cases are never simple, but right now, our priority is Lily's well-being. She handed Sarah more forms to sign. Once you take her home, I'll be conducting weekly visits for the first month, then bi-weekly after that. You'll also need to bring her to all scheduled medical appointments and court hearings. Court hearings? Sarah repeated. Yes, there will be dependency hearings to determine Lily's legal status. You'll be expected to attend. After Ms. Harmon left, Sarah sat beside Lily's bassinet, gently stroking the baby's cheek as she slept. Dad, what if they find her mother and she wants Lily back? How could I possibly let her go back to someone who threw her away like garbage? Frank had no answers. He simply placed a comforting hand on his daughter's shoulder, watching the rise and fall of Lily's tiny chest. Let's just take it one day at a time, honey. That's all we can do. The next morning, Dr. Abernathy declared Lily fit to leave the hospital. She'd gained weight, was feeding well, and showed no signs of complications from her traumatic first hours of life. Sarah arrived with a brand new car seat and a diaper bag packed with supplies, her face a mixture of excitement and terror. Are you sure I'm ready for this? She whispered to Frank as a nurse helped her properly secure Lily in the car seat. About as ready as anyone ever is with their first baby, he replied with an encouraging smile. You'll figure it out as you go, and I'm just a phone call away. The drive to Sarah's house was tense, with Sarah constantly checking the rearview mirror to make sure Lily was okay. Frank sat in the back beside the car seat, marveling at how such a tiny being could generate so much anxiety and love. Once home, Sarah settled into a routine with surprising ease. Frank stayed for the first few days, sleeping on the couch and helping with nighttime feedings. He couldn't help but notice the transformation in his daughter, how the haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a fierce determination and, increasingly, moments of genuine joy. On the 5th day, as Lily napped in her bassinet and Sarah finally took a shower, Frank's phone rang. It was Sheriff Bennett who had been leading the investigation. We've identified the mother, he said without preamble. 19-year-old girl named Melissa Taylor, college student from over in Greenfield, works part-time at a diner. We picked her up this morning. Frank stepped outside to continue the conversation, not wanting Sarah to overhear. Is she admitting to it? Broke down completely when we questioned her. Said she hid the pregnancy from everyone, delivered the baby alone in her apartment bathroom and panicked. Claims she thought the baby was stillborn. Frank frowned, remembering how still and quiet Lily had been when he found her. And if she'd been right? If the baby had been dead? She still threw her away like trash. I know, Frank. Believe me, I know. The sheriff sounded tired. But she's barely more than a kid herself, scared out of her mind, no family support to speak of. Father of the baby denies it's his and has threatened to sue her for defamation if she pursues it. What happens now? She's being charged, but given her age, lack of prior record, and the circumstances, well, the DA might be open to a plea deal, especially if she's willing to surrender parental rights. Frank absorbed this information slowly. Does she want to see the baby? There was a pause on the other end of the line. She's asking to. Says she needs to know the baby's okay. I told her I'd have to check with you and the social worker. The request stirred conflicting emotions in Frank. Part of him wanted to protect Lily and Sarah from this young woman who had done such a terrible thing. But another part of him remembered his wife Margaret's words about how understanding came before judgment. I'll talk to Sarah, he finally said. It's her decision as Lily's foster mother. When he went back inside, Sarah was sitting on the couch, Lily cradled in her arms as she gave her a bottle. The peaceful domestic scene made what he had to tell her even harder. They found her, he said simply. sitting down beside them. Lily's mother. Sarah's body went rigid, her knuckles whitening around the bottle. Who is she? Frank relayed what the sheriff had told him, watching his daughter's face carefully. To his surprise, instead of anger, a complex mixture of emotions played across Sarah's features: pity, confusion, and something like recognition. She thought Lily was stillborn? Sarah repeated. And she panicked? Frank nodded, unsure where Sarah's thoughts were heading. She wants to see Lily, he added. The sheriff asked if we'd allow it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the baby in her arms. Lily had finished her bottle and was gazing up at Sarah with those solemn dark blue eyes that seemed wise beyond her days. Yes, Sarah finally said, her voice soft but steady. I think we should let her see Lily. Frank was taken aback. Are you sure? After what she did? Sarah looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. When I lost my baby, Dad, I was in such a dark place. I couldn't think straight. I did things that weren't rational. If I'd been alone, 19, with no support. She shook her head. I'm not excusing what she did, but I think I understand the desperation that might lead someone there. Frank felt a surge of pride for his daughter's compassion, even as worry gnawed at him. What if she wants Lily back? Sarah's arms tightened protectively around the baby. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But right now, I think we need to show this girl that there are people who care, even when you make terrible mistakes. As Frank called the sheriff back to arrange the meeting, he glanced out the window toward his farm in the distance, where Whisper was undoubtedly going about her day. He wondered, not for the first time, at the chain of events the horse had set in motion and where it might ultimately lead them all. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at the sheriff's office, a compromise between the sterile environment of the jail and the intimate space of Sarah's home. Frank drove Sarah and Lily into town, his truck unusually clean after a thorough washing that morning. Sarah had dressed Lily in a pale yellow onesie with tiny embroidered daisies, and herself in a simple blue dress that Frank recognized as one of her favorites. You didn't have to get all dressed up, he remarked as they pulled into the parking lot. Sarah adjusted Lily's tiny knit cap. I know, but I want her to see that Lily is being well cared for, that she's loved. The sheriff met them at the side entrance, away from prying eyes. News of the abandoned baby had spread through Millfield like wildfire, with the local paper dubbing it The Miracle at Miller Farm. Reporters had already made several attempts to speak with Frank, and he'd declined each one. Ms. Taylor is in the conference room, Sheriff Bennett explained, leading them down a quiet hallway. She's not in restraints, but there is a deputy present. Ms. Harmon from CPS is there too. Sarah nodded, holding Lily close to her chest. Frank could see the tension in his daughter's shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the baby's blanket. You don't have to do this, he reminded her quietly. I know, Dad, but I think it's right. The conference room was small but comfortable, with a rectangular table and padded chairs. Sitting at the far end was a slight figure with hunched shoulders and long brown hair that hung like a curtain, obscuring her face. She looked up as they entered, and Frank was struck by how young she appeared, hardly more than a child herself, with frightened eyes and tear-stained cheeks. Ms. Harmon stood to greet them, her professional demeanor tempered with unusual gentleness. Ms. Miller, Mr. Miller, thank you for coming. Melissa, these are the people who have been caring for your baby. Melissa's eyes went immediately to the bundle in Sarah's arms. She made a small, choked sound that might have been a sob. Is she okay? Sarah approached slowly, her own expression a careful mask of composure. Her name is Lily. She's doing very well. Melissa stared at the baby, her hands twisting in her lap. Would it be all right if I held her? Just for a minute? Sarah hesitated, and Frank could read the conflict on her face. But then she nodded, carefully transferring Lily into Melissa's waiting arms, showing her how to support the baby's head. She's so small, Melissa whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know. When she came out, she didn't cry. She didn't move. I thought she was—" She couldn't finish the sentence, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the now alert infant. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Frank watched the scene with a lump in his throat. The girl's grief and remorse seemed genuine, but he couldn't forget the image of Lily in that garbage bag. Couldn't erase the knowledge of how close she'd come to death. "Why didn't you go to a hospital?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Or call someone for help?" Melissa flinched at his tone. "I was scared. My parents kicked me out when I was 16. I've been on my own, working and trying to stay in school. When I found out I was pregnant, I couldn't deal with it. I told myself it wasn't happening. I thought if I ignored it, it would somehow go away." She looked down at Lily, who was gazing up at her with unfocused eyes. "I know that sounds crazy now." "It doesn't sound crazy," Sarah said softly. "It sounds like you were overwhelmed and terrified." Melissa looked up at her in surprise, clearly having expected judgment rather than understanding. "I never meant to hurt her. When she came out so still and quiet, I panicked. I wrapped her up and put her—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "In the trash," Frank completed, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "You left your baby in the trash to die." "Dad," Sarah warned quietly. Melissa's face crumpled. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I'll never forgive myself. They told me a horse found her? That she might have died if not for that horse?" Frank nodded stiffly. "My mare, Whisper. She sensed something was wrong and led me to the ditch where you left Lily." "Thank God for that horse," Melissa whispered, looking back down at the baby. "And thank God for you, for finding her, for saving her." Ms. Harmon cleared her throat gently. "Melissa, did you want to discuss the legal aspects of the situation now, or would you prefer to do that separately?" The young woman's arms tightened briefly around Lily before she forced herself to relax. "No, we can talk about it now. I know I'm going to jail. I know what I did was a crime." "Yes, you're facing serious charges," Ms. Harmon confirmed. "But there's also the matter of Lily's custody and your parental rights." Melissa bit her lip. "They said I might be able to get a reduced sentence if I—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "If you voluntarily surrender your parental rights," Ms. Harmon supplied. Frank felt Sarah tense beside him. This was the moment they'd both been dreading and hoping for. Melissa looked from Lily to Sarah, then back again. "You're her foster mother?" she asked Sarah directly. Sarah nodded. "Yes. I've been caring for her since she left the hospital." "And you want to adopt her?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I would. Yes, very much. But I understand that she's your daughter, and ultimately, this is your decision." Melissa's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I was so stupid, so selfish. I told myself I didn't want her, that I couldn't possibly be a mother. But now, looking at her—" She stroked Lily's cheek with a trembling finger. "She deserves better than me. Better than a mother who could do what I did." "People make terrible mistakes sometimes," Sarah said, her voice gentle, "especially when they're scared and alone." Melissa looked up at her with surprise. "You don't hate me? After what I did?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I was angry at first," she admitted. "But hate? No, I don't hate you. I think you're very young and we're in an impossible situation with no support." Frank watched his daughter with growing admiration. Despite everything, she was showing a compassion that reminded him painfully of Margaret. Melissa seemed to come to a decision. "I want what's best for her," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "And that's not me. Not now. Maybe not ever." She looked at Ms. Harmon. "I'll sign whatever papers you need me to sign. I want her to have a real home, with someone who can love her properly." Ms. Harmon nodded. "We'll need to discuss this further with your attorney present, but I appreciate your willingness to consider what's in Lily's best interest." Melissa looked back down at Lily, who had fallen asleep in her arms. Would it be possible for me to know how she's doing sometimes? Not to interfere, just to know that she's okay." Sarah and Frank exchanged a look. This wasn't something they'd discussed. The idea of maintaining any connection with the woman who had abandoned Lily was complicated, to say the least. "I think we could arrange something," Sarah said finally. "Perhaps Ms. Harmon could pass along updates occasionally." Melissa nodded gratefully. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." The meeting concluded shortly after, with Melissa reluctantly handing Lily back to Sarah. As they prepared to leave, Melissa asked one more question. "The horse that found her, what did you say her name was?" "Whisper," Frank replied. "Whisper," Melissa repeated softly. "Would it be okay if I thanked her sometime? When all this is settled, I mean." The request caught Frank off guard. "I suppose that would be all right," he said, not quite sure what else to say. Outside in the parking lot, Sarah carefully secured Lily in her car seat while Frank stood by, still processing everything that had transpired in the conference room. "You were amazing in there," he told his daughter. "Your mother would have been proud." Sarah gave him a sad smile. "I kept thinking about what Mom always said, that understanding has to come before judgment." "She did say that a lot," Frank agreed, his chest tightening with the memory. "Still, it can't have been easy, facing the woman who almost took this little one from us." Sarah glanced at Lily, now peacefully sleeping in her car seat. "She's just a kid herself, Dad. A scared, lonely kid who made a terrible mistake." She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "I'm not excusing what she did, but I can't help thinking that if she'd had someone to turn to, someone who could have helped her, things might have turned out differently." Frank nodded slowly. "Maybe so." The drive back to Sarah's house was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Frank couldn't shake the image of Melissa's face when she'd first seen Lily. The raw emotion there, the regret. It complicated things, humanizing someone he'd found easier to think of as a monster. When they arrived, Sarah invited him to stay for dinner. As she moved around the kitchen with Lily in a baby carrier strapped to her chest, Frank was struck by how naturally she had taken to motherhood, despite the unconventional circumstances. "So what happens now?" he asked as they sat down to eat. Sarah took a sip of her water. "Ms. Harmon says if Melissa follows through with voluntarily terminating her parental rights, and if no other relatives come forward to claim Lily, I could begin the adoption process in about 6 months. And in the meantime, Lily stays with me as her foster mother. There will be court hearings, home visits, all of that. But Ms. Harmon seems optimistic." Sarah hesitated. "There's something else I've been thinking about." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I want to set up a trust fund for Melissa's education. A small one, from the money Mom left me. Not a reward for what she did, but a chance for her to build a better life when she gets out." Frank stared at his daughter in astonishment. "Sarah, that girl left Lily to die." "I know, Dad, and she's going to pay for that. She'll serve time. She'll live with the guilt forever." Sarah looked down at Lily, sleeping peacefully against her chest. "But she's also giving me the greatest gift imaginable by letting me be Lily's mother. I think Mom would have wanted me to pay that forward somehow." Frank shook his head in wonder. "You're something else, you know that? Just like your mother." Sarah smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I miss her. I wish she could have met Lily." "She would have adored her," Frank said softly. "Just like I do. Just like you do." After dinner, as Frank prepared to head back to the farm, Sarah walked him to the door with Lily still strapped to her chest. "Bring Whisper by sometime," she said. "I want Lily to meet the horse who saved her life." Frank nodded, touched by the suggestion. "I think Whisper would like that. She's been acting restless lately, like she's waiting for something." "Maybe she's waiting to see Lily again," Sarah suggested with a small smile, "to make sure she's really okay." The idea wasn't as far-fetched as it might have seemed to Frank a week ago. After all, Whisper had somehow known exactly where to find Lily that night. Who was to say what else the mayor might understand? As he drove home in the gathering dusk, Frank thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this point. A horse's intuition, a baby discarded, a young mother's terrible mistake, and his daughter's unexpected chance at motherhood. It was too early to know how it would all turn out, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the future. When he pulled up to the farm, Whisper was waiting at the fence, just as she had been every evening since the night she'd found Lily. Frank approached her, stroking her neck affectionately. "The baby's doing just fine, girl," he told her, "and you'll get to see her soon. Sarah's bringing her out to meet you." Whisper nickered softly, pushing her velvety nose against his shoulder as if in understanding. In that moment, Frank felt a profound connection not just to the horse, but to everything around him, the land, the sky, the cycle of life and death and rebirth that governed it all. "You did good, Whisper," he murmured. "You did real good." 2 weeks passed, settling into a new routine. Sarah had taken extended leave from her teaching position, using the family medical leave she'd accumulated but never used during her pregnancy. Lily grew stronger each day, her tiny features becoming more defined, her dark blue eyes tracking movement with increasing alertness. The quiet house that had once felt like a mausoleum to Sarah's grief now hummed with life. Midnight feedings, lullabies, the gentle rhythm of rocking a baby to sleep. Frank visited nearly every day, bringing fresh vegetables from his garden and occasionally taking over baby duties so Sarah could shower or nap. He marveled at the transformation in his daughter, how the hollow-eyed woman of the past year had been replaced by someone who smiled easily, who sang around the house, who looked toward the future with hope rather than dread. The story of Lily's rescue had spread throughout Millfield and beyond, with several newspapers and even a national morning show requesting interviews. Frank and Sarah declined them all, protective of their fragile new happiness and concerned about the impact such publicity might have on Lily's future. Still, they couldn't entirely escape the attention. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles and baby clothes. The local church group organized a meal train, and Sarah's colleagues sent a massive gift basket filled with books and toys. "People are being so kind," Sarah remarked one afternoon as she sorted through another delivery of baby supplies that had appeared on her porch. "It's overwhelming." "Folks want to be part of a happy ending," Frank replied, cradling Lily while Sarah folded tiny onesies. "Especially one with a horse hero." Speaking of Whisper, the mayor continued to show unusual interest in Lily's welfare. Whenever Frank returned from visiting Sarah and the baby, Whisper would approach him at the fence, nickering softly as if asking for an update. He'd taken to giving her detailed reports, feeling only slightly foolish for doing so. "I think it's time Lily met her rescuer," Sarah decided on a particularly pleasant spring morning. "If you bring the truck over, we can drive out to the farm this afternoon." The idea filled Frank with an unexpected excitement. He hurried home to prepare, mucking out Whisper's stall and grooming her until her chestnut coat gleamed in the sunlight. By the time he returned to pick up Sarah and Lily, Whisper had been fitted with a new halter, and the paddock had been cleared of any potential hazards. Sarah packed the diaper bag with methodical care, checking and rechecking to ensure she had everything Lily might need for their outing. It was their first trip beyond the pediatrician's office and the sheriff's department, and Frank could see the mixture of anticipation and anxiety on his daughter's face. "It's just the farm," he reminded her gently. "If you forget something, we can always come back." Sarah gave him a sheepish smile. "I know. I just want everything to be perfect for her first big adventure." The drive to the farm was peaceful, with Lily sleeping soundly in her car seat. As they pulled up the long driveway, Frank noticed Whisper standing alert at the fence, ears pricked forward as if she'd been expecting them. He helped Sarah unload the baby and all her accessories, including a portable bassinet that he set up in the shade of the old oak tree near the paddock. "Let's give Whisper a chance to adjust to Lily's presence before we bring them too close together," Frank suggested. She's gentle, but she's still a 1,000-pound animal. Sarah nodded, settling on a blanket beside the bassinet where Lily was now awake, her tiny fists waving in the air as she took in the new surroundings. Frank approached the fence, calling softly to Whisper. The mare trotted over immediately, her intelligent eyes fixed not on Frank, but on the baby beyond him. "That's right, girl," he murmured, stroking her neck. "That's the little one you found. She's doing just fine, thanks to you." Whisper nickered softly, straining her neck to see beyond the fence. Frank opened the gate and led her out by the halter, speaking soothingly as they approached Sarah and Lily. To his surprise, the mare showed none of her usual caution around strangers, moving with purposeful calm toward the bassinet. Sarah watched with wide eyes as Whisper drew near, her body tense with protective instinct. "She won't hurt her, will she, Dad?" "No," Frank said with certainty. "Whisper knows this baby is precious." The mare stopped a few feet from the bassinet, lowering her head to peer inside. Her nostrils flared as she took in Lily's scent, and she made a soft whickering sound that Frank had never heard before, almost like a greeting. Lily, for her part, seemed equally fascinated by the horse, her dark blue eyes fixed on Whisper's massive head, and her tiny mouth opened in what might have been a smile or simply gas, but which Frank chose to interpret as recognition. "Look at that," Sarah whispered, her tension easing as she witnessed the gentle interaction. "It's like they know each other." "Maybe they do," Frank replied. "In some way we don't understand." They spent the afternoon in the dappled shade of the oak tree, with Whisper grazing nearby, occasionally returning to check on Lily as if making sure the baby was still there, still safe. Sarah relaxed enough to enjoy a picnic lunch Frank had prepared, and even dozed briefly on the blanket while he kept watch over Lily. It was, Frank thought, as close to perfect as a day could be. That evening, as they packed up to return to Sarah's house, Ms. Harmon called with an update. Sarah put the call on speaker so Frank could hear as he secured Lily's car seat. "I wanted to let you know that Melissa Taylor has formally signed the paperwork to voluntarily terminate her parental rights," Ms. Harmon informed them. "Her attorney believes this will factor favorably in her sentencing, though she's still likely facing some jail time." Sarah and Frank exchanged a look loaded with complex emotions. "What happens next?" Sarah asked. "We'll file the paperwork with the court. There will be a hearing to legally terminate her rights, then a waiting period to ensure no other relatives come forward. After that, if all goes well, you can begin the formal adoption process." "And what about Melissa?" Sarah asked quietly. "Has a sentencing date been set?" Ms. Harmon's voice softened slightly. "Not yet. The DA is considering the circumstances carefully. Her attorney mentioned that you had expressed a desire to establish some kind of trust for her education." "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "I'd like to help her get back on her feet when this is all over. She made a terrible mistake, but I don't think her whole life should be defined by it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's very generous of you, Ms. Miller. I've worked in child welfare for 15 years, and I don't often see this kind of compassion in cases like these." After the call ended, Frank helped Sarah load the last of their things into the truck. As they prepared to leave, Whisper approached the fence once more, watching them intently. "We'll bring her back to visit," Sarah promised the horse, surprising Frank with the earnestness in her voice. "She should know the one who saved her." The following week brought the first court hearing regarding Lily's status. Frank sat in the back of the courtroom while Sarah, dressed in a conservative navy suit, held Lily and answered the judge's questions about her ability to provide a stable home. Ms. Harmon testified to Sarah's fitness as a foster parent, and Dr. Abernathy spoke about the strong bond already forming between Sarah and the baby. Melissa was not present, her interests represented by a court-appointed attorney who confirmed her desire to terminate her parental rights voluntarily. The judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, reviewed the paperwork carefully before addressing the court. "Having reviewed the evidence and testimony presented, I find that the biological mother's decision to relinquish her parental rights appears knowing and voluntary. Before finalizing this decision, however, I am ordering a 45-day waiting period during which any potential relatives of the child may come forward." She looked directly at Sarah. "Ms. Miller, you should be aware that if a suitable relative expresses interest in custody, they would typically be given preference under the law. However, given the circumstances of this case and the bond you have established with the infant, any such claim would be carefully weighed against the child's best interests. Sarah nodded, her arms tightening almost imperceptibly around Lily. Frank could read the fear in his daughter's posture, the terror of having this baby she already loved taken away from her. After the hearing, they met briefly with Ms. Harmon in the courthouse corridor. "Try not to worry too much," she advised, noting Sarah's anxious expression. "Cases where relatives suddenly appear are relatively rare, especially in situations like this where the mother concealed the pregnancy." "But it could happen," Sarah pressed. Ms. Harmon couldn't deny it. "Yes, it could. The father could come forward, or grandparents, aunts, uncles. But Melissa has indicated that the father wants nothing to do with the baby, and she's been estranged from her family for years." The drive back to Sarah's house was subdued, both of them contemplating the precariousness of their situation. Lily, oblivious to the adults' concerns, slept peacefully in her car seat, one tiny hand curled around the ear of a stuffed horse that Frank had bought her. "I don't think I could bear to lose her," Sarah admitted quietly, looking out the window at the passing landscape. "I know I've only had her for a few weeks, but she already feels like mine." Frank reached over to squeeze his daughter's hand. "I know, honey, but let's not borrow trouble. The odds are in our favor." That night, after helping Sarah give Lily her bath and put her to bed, Frank sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sheriff Bennett. "Thought you should know. Sentencing hearing for Melissa Taylor set for next week. DA recommending 18 months. Eligible for parole in 6 with good behavior." Frank stared at the message, trying to reconcile his lingering anger at what Melissa had done with the compassion he'd felt when seeing her broken remorse in person. 18 months seemed simultaneously too harsh, and not harsh enough for what could have been a fatal abandonment. He was still mulling this over when Sarah joined him on the porch, baby monitor in hand. "Lily's sound asleep," she reported, settling into the chair beside him. "What's on your mind, Dad? You look troubled." He showed her the text message. Sarah read it silently, her expression unreadable in the dim porch light. "It's not as long as I expected," she finally said. "But still, 18 months in jail for a 19-year-old girl. She left her baby to die, Sarah." "I know." Sarah's voice was soft but firm, "and she deserves consequences for that. But I keep thinking about how alone and desperate she must have been. No family, no support system. Probably terrified out of her mind." Frank shook his head in wonder. "You're a better person than I am, honey. I'm still angry when I think about finding Lily in that trash bag." "I'm angry too," Sarah admitted. "But I also know that Melissa's mistake gave me the most precious gift I could imagine." She paused, looking out at the night sky. "Did I tell you I went to see her? At the jail?" Frank turned to his daughter in surprise. "No, you didn't mention that. I went yesterday while you were running errands in town. I wanted to tell her about the trust fund I'm setting up, but also..." She hesitated. "I wanted to ask her about Lily's father, about any family history I should know about for medical reasons." "And?" "She told me everything she could. The father was a one-night stand, a guy passing through town who gave her a fake name. Her own family history isn't great. Alcoholism, some mental health issues, but nothing immediately concerning for Lily." Frank nodded, processing this. "How did she seem?" "Broken," Sarah said simply. "Resigned to her punishment. Grateful that Lily is safe." She glanced at her father. She asked about Whisper again. Seems fascinated by the idea of a horse finding her baby. Frank smiled faintly. "Whisper is pretty special." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the distant sound of crickets and the occasional car passing on the main road. "I'm thinking of inviting Melissa's attorney to the farm," Sarah said suddenly. "To meet Whisper, take some pictures to show Melissa in jail." Would that be okay with you? Frank considered the request. Part of him wanted to keep his distance from the young woman who had nearly caused a tragedy, but a larger part recognized the healing that might come from such a gesture. I suppose that would be all right, he agreed. Sarah leaned over to kiss his cheek. Thanks, Dad, for everything. For finding Lily. For supporting me. For sharing Whisper. No need to thank me, he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the emotion welling up in his chest. That's what family does. As they sat together on the porch, a cool breeze stirring the spring air, Frank contemplated the strange, winding path that had led them here. A horse's intuition, a baby discarded, a family reborn from grief. It wasn't the way he would have chosen, but then, the most important journeys rarely followed the expected route. Inside the house, Lily slept peacefully, unaware of the complex circumstances of her rescue or the legal proceedings that would determine her future. For now, she was simply a baby, loved and wanted, with a horse watching over her from afar and a family willing to fight to keep her safe. As summer approached, Lily flourished under Sarah's devoted care. The delicate newborn had transformed into a chubby, alert 3-month-old who tracked movements with curious eyes and had recently discovered the joy of her own smile. Each milestone, the first time she rolled over, the first genuine laugh, was celebrated with phone calls and photographs sent to Frank, who displayed them proudly on his refrigerator. The legal process continued its slow, methodical pace. Melissa had been sentenced to 18 months as expected, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. She'd written a letter to Sarah from jail, expressing gratitude for the updates on Lily and for the trust fund Sarah had established for her future education. The letter, penned in neat, careful handwriting, now sat in a drawer in Sarah's desk, a complicated artifact of Lily's origins that Sarah wasn't quite sure what to do with, but couldn't bring herself to throw away. The mandatory waiting period for relatives to come forward was nearly over, with no one stepping forward to claim Lily. Sarah had begun allowing herself to believe that soon the adoption process could begin in earnest. Ms. Harmon had prepared her for the extensive home studies, background checks, and interviews that would follow. But Sarah was undaunted. Lily was worth any amount of scrutiny and paperwork. Frank was repairing a fence on the eastern edge of his property when Sheriff Bennett's cruiser pulled up the long driveway. It was unusual for the sheriff to make personal visits without calling first, and Frank felt a prickle of unease as he set down his tools and walked over to meet him. "Morning, Frank," Bennett said, removing his hat as he stepped out of the vehicle. "Sorry to drop by unannounced." "No problem," Frank replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What brings you out this way?" The sheriff's expression was grave. "Got some news I thought you should hear in person before it reaches Sarah. It's about Lily." Frank's heart seemed to stutter. "What about her?" "A man came into the station yesterday claiming to be her father. Says his name is Jason Reeves, 24 years old, works construction over in Greenfield." Frank felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Melissa said the father wanted nothing to do with the baby. Said he denied it was even his. "That's what she told us too," Bennett agreed. "But this guy's story matches up with hers in several details. Says he met her at a bar last summer. They had a brief thing. He moved on. Claims he had no idea she was pregnant until he saw her picture in the paper after the arrest. And he just now decided to come forward." Frank couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. "Weeks after the story broke?" "Says he's been wrestling with the decision. Wasn't sure if he was ready to be a father, but couldn't stop thinking about the baby." Bennett shifted uncomfortably. "He's requesting a paternity test." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. If this man proved to be Lily's biological father and wanted custody, he would have a strong legal claim. The carefully constructed new life that Sarah and Lily were building together could be shattered in an instant. "Does Sarah know yet?" Frank asked, his mouth dry. "Not officially. I wanted to tell you first, give you a chance to prepare her." Bennett put his hat back on, his expression sympathetic. "For what it's worth, I ran a background check on this Reeves fellow. No criminal record, steady job history. Seems respectable enough on paper." Frank nodded mechanically, his mind racing with implications. Thanks for coming out to tell me, Bill. I appreciate it. After the sheriff left, Frank stood motionless in the yard, trying to process this new threat to his family's happiness. Whisper approached the fence, sensing his distress, and nickered softly. Frank walked over to her, finding comfort in the mare's steady presence. We might have trouble, girl, he told her, stroking her neck absently. Someone's come to claim Lily. The drive to Sarah's house felt interminable. Frank rehearsed what he would say, how he would break the news gently, but there was no way to soften this particular blow. When he arrived, Sarah was in the backyard with Lily, sitting on a blanket under the shade of a maple tree. The peaceful domestic scene made his heart ache with the knowledge that he was about to disrupt it. Dad, Sarah called cheerfully, waving him over. You're just in time. Lily's been showing off her rolling skills. Frank forced a smile as he joined them on the blanket. Lily, dressed in a strawberry-patterned onesie, gurgled happily at the sight of him, her tiny hands reaching up. He lifted her carefully, inhaling the sweet baby scent of her as he held her close. She gets stronger every day, he remarked, trying to keep his voice normal. Sarah nodded proudly. The pediatrician says she's right on track developmentally, maybe even a little ahead. Can you believe it, considering how she started? Frank set Lily back on the blanket, his expression sobering. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Sheriff Bennett came by the farm this morning. Sarah's smile faded, sensing his tone. What is it? What's happened? He told her about Jason Reeves as gently as he could, watching her face pale as the implications sank in. But the waiting period is almost over, she protested, her voice rising with panic. Just a few more days and we would have been in the clear. I know, honey. And why now? Why wait all this time to come forward? She gathered Lily into her arms, as if someone might take the baby from her at any moment. Melissa said he wanted nothing to do with the baby, that he threatened to sue her if she claimed it was his. According to Bennett, he's had a change of heart. Frank reached out to place a steadying hand on his daughter's shoulder. Look, we don't know for sure that he's the father. He's requesting a paternity test, but that doesn't mean... If he is the father and he wants her, I could lose her, Sarah interrupted, tears welling in her eyes. The courts favor biological parents. You know that. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Frank urged, though his own heart was heavy with the same fear. We should call Ms. Harmon, find out what our options are. Sarah nodded numbly, her arms tightening around Lily, who sensed the change in mood and began to fuss. Shh, it's okay, sweetheart, Sarah soothed, her voice trembling as she rocked the baby. Everything's going to be okay. Frank hoped with all his heart that she was right. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and legal consultations. Ms. Harmon confirmed their fears. If Jason Reeves proved to be Lily's biological father and was deemed fit, he would have a strong claim to custody, potentially displacing Sarah as the foster parent. It doesn't mean he would automatically get custody, Ms. Harmon explained during a tense meeting at her office. The court still considers the best interests of the child, but biological ties carry significant weight, especially when the father has no history of abuse or neglect. He abandoned them both, Sarah argued, her voice tight with emotion. He knew Melissa was on her own, struggling. Even if he didn't know she was pregnant, he left her to deal with the consequences of their encounter alone. Ms. Harmon's expression was sympathetic but realistic. That's not abandonment in the legal sense, I'm afraid. And if he truly didn't know about the pregnancy, the court won't hold that against him. So what can we do? Frank asked, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. First, we wait for the paternity test results. If he's not the father, this all becomes moot. If he is... Ms. Harmon hesitated. We could argue that Lily's best interests are served by remaining with Sarah, given the stable home she's providing and the bond they've formed. But I won't lie to you. It would be an uphill battle. The paternity test was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Sarah moved through her days in a fog of dread, holding Lily more tightly, taking more photographs, as if trying to memorize every detail of the baby she might lose. Frank, determined to do something, anything to help, decided to learn more about Jason Reeves. He drove to Greenfield, a larger town about 30 miles from Millfield, and spent a day discreetly asking questions at local businesses. What he discovered was frustratingly mundane. Reeves was indeed a construction worker with a decent reputation, lived in a modest apartment, no known trouble with the law. Not the villain Frank had half hoped to uncover, whose unfitness for parenthood would be obvious to any judge. On the day of the paternity test, Frank accompanied Sarah and Lily to the clinic. They sat in the waiting room, tension radiating from Sarah as she clutched Lily's carrier. When Jason Reeves walked in, Frank studied him intently. A tall, broad-shouldered man with short brown hair and a cautious expression. He nodded awkwardly in their direction before checking in at the reception desk. "That's him," Sarah whispered, her knuckles white around the handle of Lily's carrier. The actual test was brief and non-invasive, involving just a cheek swab for both Reeves and Lily. They were told the results would take about 3 business days. As they prepared to leave, Reeves approached them hesitantly. "I just wanted to say," he began, his voice unexpectedly soft for such a large man, "that I can see she's being well cared for. I'm not trying to disrupt her life. When I found out there was a possibility she might be mine, I couldn't just walk away without knowing for sure." Sarah's response was cold. "You walked away from her mother easily enough." Reeves flinched. "I didn't know Melissa was pregnant. I swear I didn't. We only spent 1 weekend together." "And you gave her a fake name," Sarah accused. "No, I didn't," he insisted. "My full name is Jason Thomas Reeves. I go by JT to most people, that's all." Frank placed a restraining hand on Sarah's arm, sensing her rising anger. "This isn't the place for this conversation," he said quietly. "We should go." Outside in the parking lot, Sarah broke down in tears once Lily was secured in her car seat. "I hate this," she sobbed against Frank's shoulder. "I hate feeling like my whole life is hanging on a DNA test." "I know, honey," he murmured, holding her close. "I know." The 3 days until the test results were due felt like an eternity. Sarah took Lily to the farm more frequently, as if the peaceful surroundings and Whisper's steady presence could somehow shield them from the uncertainty of their situation. The mare seemed to sense the tension, staying close whenever Lily was near, watching over the baby with what Frank could only describe as protective vigilance. On the 3rd day, Ms. Harmon called with the news they had been dreading. Jason Reeves was indeed Lily's biological father. "He's filed for custody," she informed them, her voice carefully professional. "There will be a hearing next week. In the meantime, he's requesting visitation rights." Sarah's face crumpled at the news, but she quickly composed herself, years of teaching middle schoolers having taught her to manage her emotions in crisis. "What are our chances?" she asked directly. Ms. Harmon hesitated. "It's complicated. On one hand, you've provided Lily with excellent care during a critical period of her development, and there's a strong attachment forming between you. On the other hand, Mr. Reeves is the biological father, has no history of abuse or neglect, and is expressing a sincere desire to parent his child." "So he gets to swoop in and take her just like that?" Frank demanded, unable to contain his frustration. "The court will consider all factors, Mr. Miller, including the unusual circumstances of Lily's early life and rescue." Ms. Harmon's voice softened slightly. "I'll be advocating for a transition period at minimum, to allow Lily to adjust gradually to any change in custody, should the court rule in Mr. Reeves's favor." After the call ended, Sarah sat motionless on the couch, staring at Lily sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. "I can't lose her, Dad," she whispered. "I just can't." Frank sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We'll fight this, Sarah. Whatever it takes. But what if fighting isn't enough? What if the law says he has more right to her than I do, just because of biology?" She looked up at him, her eyes hollow with fear. "I've already lost so much. I don't think I could survive losing her too." Frank had no answers, only a fierce determination to protect his daughter and granddaughter however he could. As the sun set over the farm, casting long shadows across the fields, he found himself at the fence where Whisper stood watching, her eyes seeming to reflect his own concern. "We might lose her, girl," he told the mare softly. "After everything, we might still lose her." Whisper nickered softly, pushing her head against his chest in a gesture that felt like comfort. Frank stroked her neck, wondering at the strange bond that had formed between the horse and the baby she had saved, a bond that now faced its greatest test. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early July. Sarah spent the night before at Frank's farm, unable to face her empty house with its nursery filled with Lily's things that might soon be packed away or sent to a stranger's home. She barely slept, checking on Lily repeatedly throughout the night, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the sound of her breathing, the perfect tiny fingernails that Sarah had carefully trimmed just yesterday. Frank rose before dawn, making coffee and a simple breakfast that neither of them had the appetite to eat. They dressed in somber, courtroom-appropriate attire. Sarah in a navy dress that emphasized her responsible teacher image. Frank in the one suit he owned, purchased years ago for Margaret's funeral. "Whatever happens today," Frank said as they prepared to leave, "we know that Lily is loved, that we did everything we could for her." Sarah nodded, her face pale but composed as she secured Lily in her car seat. The baby was dressed in a white eyelet dress with a tiny pink cardigan, an outfit Sarah had chosen with painstaking care, as if Lily's appearance might somehow influence the judge's decision. The courthouse was busier than Frank had expected, with several other family cases apparently scheduled for the same morning. They checked in with the clerk and were directed to a bench outside the courtroom, where they found Ms. Harmon waiting for them, briefcase in hand. "I've reviewed all the reports," she told them quietly. "Mr. Reeves has submitted character references from his employer and several friends, all attesting to his responsibility and work ethic. He's also secured a 2-bedroom apartment and has arranged flexible working hours to accommodate childcare." Sarah's hands tightened around Lily's carrier. "He's really prepared then?" Ms. Harmon nodded. "He appears serious about wanting to parent Lily. However, we have strong arguments as well. The bond you formed with her, the stability you provide, your experience as an educator." Frank scanned the corridor, his eyes eventually landing on a tall figure seated at the far end. Jason Reeves, dressed in what appeared to be a new suit, his hair neatly combed, looking every inch the responsible young father, eager to claim his child. Beside him sat an older woman with similar features, presumably his mother. Before Frank could point him out to Sarah, the courtroom doors opened and they were called in. The hearing room was smaller than Frank had imagined, with just a few rows of seats facing the judge's bench. They took their places at one table, while Reeves and his attorney settled at another. Lily, perhaps sensing the tension, began to fuss softly in her carrier. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, lifting the baby to her shoulder and patting her back gently. "Mommy's here." The word "mommy" hung in the air, loaded with both truth and precariousness. Frank saw Reeves watching the interaction, his expression unreadable. Judge Eleanor Wilson entered the courtroom, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She reviewed the case file silently for several minutes before addressing the room. "This is a hearing to determine custody arrangements for the minor child, Lily Jane Doe, currently in foster care with Sarah Miller. I understand that paternity has been established, confirming Jason Thomas Reeves as the biological father." She looked up, her gaze direct. "I want to be clear from the outset that this court's primary concern is the best interests of the child. Is that understood by all parties?" Both attorneys confirmed their understanding, and the proceedings began. The attorneys presented their arguments, with Reeves's lawyer emphasizing his biological connection to Lily and his sincere desire to parent her, while Ms. Harmon highlighted Sarah's excellent care and the strong attachment that had formed between her and the baby. When it was time for testimony, Sarah spoke first, her voice steady despite the emotion Frank knew she must be feeling. "I've loved Lily from the moment I first held her," she told the court. She came into my life when I was still grieving the loss of my own baby last year. Caring for her has healed something in me that I thought was broken forever. We formed a bond that I believe is as real and important as any biological connection." She described their daily routines, Lily's developmental progress, the network of support they had in the community. "Lily doesn't just have me," Sarah explained. "She has my father, who visits daily. She has Whisper, the horse who found her and saved her life. She has a pediatrician who knows her history, neighbors who bring casseroles and baby clothes, my colleagues who've already offered babysitting when I returned to teaching." When it was Reeves's turn to speak, he appeared nervous, but determined. "I know I'm coming into this late," he admitted, "and I can see that Ms. Miller has taken excellent care of my daughter. But when I found out about Lily, when I realized I had a child out there, something changed in me. I couldn't just walk away." He described his plans for Lily's care, the childcare arrangements he'd made, the support his mother had offered to provide. "I've never been a father before," he acknowledged. "I have a lot to learn, but I want the chance to be there for my daughter, to give her the stable home and family she deserves." Judge Wilson listened to both testimonies without interruption, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. When the attorneys had finished their closing arguments, she announced a brief recess to consider her decision. In the corridor outside, Sarah paced with Lily, who had grown fussy and overtired from the unfamiliar surroundings and disrupted schedule. Frank watched his daughter soothe the baby with practiced ease, knowing that every gentle bounce, every soft word might be among the last such moments they would share. He was so focused on Sarah and Lily that he didn't notice Reeves approaching until the man cleared his throat awkwardly. "She seems upset," Reeves observed, gesturing to Lily. "Is she okay?" Sarah stiffened. "She's fine, just tired and overwhelmed by all this." Her tone was cool but not hostile. Reeves nodded, shifting uncomfortably. "Look, I know you think I'm the bad guy here, but I really do care about what happens to her." "Do you?" Sarah challenged, her voice low to avoid disturbing Lily, who was finally settling against her shoulder. "Or do you just care about your rights as her father?" "Both," Reeves admitted. "I didn't ask for any of this. Finding out I had a daughter this way, through news about her mother abandoning her, it's been a shock. But I can't pretend she doesn't exist. I can't walk away knowing I have a child out there." Before Sarah could respond, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Wilson had returned, her expression grave as they took their seats. "In cases like these," she began, "there are rarely simple answers. The law generally presumes that a child's interests are best served by being in the custody of a biological parent, provided that parent is fit and willing to assume responsibility. However, the law also recognizes the importance of stability and established attachments, particularly in infants." She shuffled through the papers before her. "Mr. Reeves has established paternity and demonstrated a sincere desire to parent his child. He has taken concrete steps to prepare for Lily's care and has no history that would disqualify him as a parent." Frank felt Sarah tense beside him, her hand gripping his so tightly it hurt. "Ms. Miller," Judge Wilson continued, "has provided excellent care for Lily during a critical period of her development. She has formed a strong attachment with the child and has created a stable, nurturing environment." The judge paused, looking directly at both Sarah and Reeves. "In weighing these factors, I am reminded that the purpose of this court is not to reward or punish adults, but to ensure the well-being of the child. Lily has already experienced significant trauma in her short life. To abruptly remove her from the only home and caregiver she has known would risk further trauma." Frank held his breath, hope and fear battling in his chest. "Therefore, I am ordering a gradual transition plan, with Ms. Miller retaining primary physical custody for the next 3 months, during which time Mr. Reeves will have increasingly frequent visitation rights, beginning with supervised visits and progressing to overnight stays." Sarah let out a small, choked sound that might have been relief or despair. "At the end of this 3-month period," the judge continued, Assuming all visits proceed satisfactorily, custody will transfer to Mr. Reeves, with Ms. Miller retaining generous visitation rights. This arrangement will be subject to review in 6 months to assess whether it continues to serve Lily's best interests. The judge's final words faded into a buzzing in Frank's ears as he absorbed the implications. Sarah hadn't lost Lily, not today. But in 3 months, unless something changed, she would have to hand over the baby she'd come to think of as her daughter to a man who was essentially a stranger. Outside the courtroom, Ms. Harmon attempted to put a positive spin on the ruling. "This gives us time," she emphasized. "Time for Mr. Reeves to demonstrate whether he's truly committed to parenting Lily. Time for us to potentially negotiate a more permanent shared custody arrangement." Sarah nodded mechanically, her eyes fixed on Lily, who had fallen asleep in her carrier, blissfully unaware of the adults determining her fate. 3 months, she whispered. "That's all I'm guaranteed." The first supervised visit was scheduled for the following Saturday at a neutral location, a family visitation center that provided a home-like setting with trained observers present. Frank offered to drive Sarah and Lily, concerned about his daughter's emotional state. "I'll be fine, Dad," she insisted, though the shadows under her eyes told a different story. "I need to get used to handling this on my own." The week leading up to the visit was tense. Sarah oscillated between determined optimism, maybe he'll realize he's not ready for full-time parenting, and deep despair. "I'm going to lose her, Dad, and there's nothing I can do about it." Frank, feeling helpless to fix the situation, focused on practical support, bringing meals, watching Lily so Sarah could shower or nap, maintaining the farm and caring for Whisper. The mayor seemed to sense that something was wrong, growing increasingly restless in the days after the hearing. Frank had taken to spending extra time with her, explaining the situation as if she could understand. "The man says he's Lily's father," he told her one evening, stroking her neck as they watched the sunset together. "And the law says that matters more than who loves her most." On Saturday morning, Frank arrived at Sarah's house to find her sitting on the floor of Lily's nursery, the baby in her lap, both of them dressed and ready but seemingly unable to move toward the inevitable. "I don't know if I can do this, Dad," Sarah confessed, her voice breaking. "Watch him hold her, feed her, knowing that soon he'll be taking her home with him." Frank knelt beside them, his knees protesting the movement. "You can do it because Lily needs you to. Because being part of her life, even if it's not the way you'd hoped, is better than not being in it at all." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath before standing with Lily in her arms. "Let's get this over with." The family visitation center was a converted Victorian house with a sign proclaiming it Safe Harbors Family Center. Inside, cheerful murals decorated the walls, and child-sized furniture filled the common areas. A social worker named Diane greeted them, explaining the procedures and showing them to a room set up with comfortable seating, toys, and a changing station. Jason Reeves arrived precisely on time, carrying a gift bag and looking as nervous as Sarah felt. Diane facilitated the introductions, then sat discreetly in a corner with a clipboard, observing but not interfering. "I brought something for Lily," Reeves said, offering the bag to Sarah with an awkward gesture. "It's not much, just a stuffed animal." Sarah accepted the bag, removing a soft plush horse with a creamy-colored coat. Despite herself, she felt a flicker of appreciation for the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you. She's actually very fond of horses." "I heard about the one that found her," Reeves replied. "Pretty amazing story." Sarah nodded, finding herself unexpectedly tongue-tied. This was the man who might raise her daughter, whose decisions would shape Lily's life. The weight of that reality pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. "Would it be okay if I held her?" Reeves asked hesitantly. Sarah steeled herself, then carefully transferred Lily to his arms, showing him how to support her head, even though she had good control now. Lily, to Sarah's mixed relief and dismay, didn't protest the handover, regarding Reeves with curious eyes. "Hi there, little one," he murmured, his large hands looking almost comically oversized against Lily's small form. "I'm your dad." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure, watching as Lily reached up to bat at Reeves's chin with a tiny hand. He smiled, genuinely delighted by the interaction, and Sarah felt her certainty waver. He wasn't a monster, wasn't trying to hurt her or Lily. He was just a man who had discovered he had a child and wanted to be part of her life. The visit proceeded with surprising smoothness. Reeves asked questions about Lily's routine, her preferences, her development. He took notes when Sarah explained how she liked to be held during bottle feeding, which songs soothed her when she was fussy, the early warning signs that she was getting overtired. "You're really good with her," he observed after watching Sarah change Lily's diaper with practiced efficiency. "I have a lot to learn." "She's easy to love," Sarah replied, unable to keep a note of sadness from her voice. As the 2-hour visit drew to a close, Reeves seemed reluctant to leave. "Same time next week?" he confirmed, touching Lily's cheek gently in farewell. Sarah nodded, already dreading the next visit, which would be longer, and the one after that, which would include taking Lily out for a short excursion. Step by step, visit by visit, she was being asked to prepare Lily for a transition that broke her heart to contemplate. In the car on the way home, with Lily dozing in her car seat, Frank finally asked the question that had been on his mind throughout the visit. "What did you think of him, now that you've spent some time together?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the familiar landscape pass by outside the window. "He seems to genuinely care about her," she admitted, "and he was trying so hard to do everything right." She turned to look at her father, tears glistening in her eyes. "Which makes this all so much harder, because I can't even hate him for taking her away from me." Frank reached across to squeeze his daughter's hand, his heart aching for her impossible situation. "Maybe there's a way forward that doesn't have to be all or nothing. Maybe you can both be part of her life." Sarah shook her head, unconvinced. "The judge made it pretty clear. In 3 months, Lily goes to live with him. I get visitation rights, like I'm some distant relative instead of the woman who's been her mother in every way that matters." As they pulled into Sarah's driveway, Lily woke with a whimper that quickly escalated into a full cry. Sarah unbuckled her from the car seat and held her close, swaying gently as she had countless times before. "Shh. It's okay, Lily love," she murmured. "Mommy's here. Mommy's got you." Frank watched them, the word mommy echoing in his mind. In 3 months, would Lily still know who her mommy was? Or would she adapt to her new reality, with Jason Reeves as daddy and Sarah reduced to a visitor in her life? The thought was almost too painful to bear. The weeks following the custody hearing blurred together in a painful haze. Sarah moved through her days mechanically, caring for Lily with the same devotion as always while preparing for the inevitable transition. She created detailed notes about Lily's routines, preferences, and developmental milestones to share with Reeves. She took hundreds of photographs, as if trying to capture every moment, every expression, before they slipped away from her. The supervised visits gradually increased in frequency and duration. To Sarah's dismay, Lily seemed to be bonding with Reeves, responding to his voice with smiles, and reaching for him when he arrived for visits. She tried to be grateful for this. Wouldn't it be worse if Lily were frightened of or uncomfortable with the man who would soon be her primary caregiver? But each smile Lily gave him felt like a small betrayal. Frank worried constantly about his daughter. The bright spark that had returned to her eyes when Lily came into her life was dimming again, replaced by a resignation that reminded him too much of the months after her miscarriage. He found himself spending more time at the farm with Whisper, finding solace in the mare's steady presence and seemingly intuitive understanding. "I don't know what to do, girl," he confided one evening, leaning against the fence as Whisper nuzzled his shoulder. "I can't fix this for her. I can't make it better." July faded into August, bringing relentless heat and thunderstorms that rolled across the countryside like premonitions. The first overnight visit loomed, 8 hours during which Lily would be away from Sarah for the first time since leaving the hospital. Sarah prepared the diaper bag with obsessive thoroughness, including detailed instructions for everything from bedtime routines to the specific way Lily liked to be held when falling asleep. "I think I've covered everything," she told Frank the night before, her voice strained as she rechecked the bag's contents. "But what if I've forgotten something important? What if she gets upset and he doesn't know how to comfort her?" "He'll call if he needs help," Frank assured her, though his own stomach churned at the thought of Lily away from Sarah's expert care. "And it's just for one night. You'll get through it." Sarah nodded, but the haunted look in her eyes told him she was already counting down the days until the full transition, now less than a month away. The court had set September 15th as the date when Lily would officially move to Reeves's home, with Sarah's role reduced to weekend visits. The overnight visit came and went without incident. Reeves returned Lily the next morning, reporting that she had eaten well, slept through most of the night, and seemed to have adjusted easily to his apartment. Sarah received this news with a complicated mixture of relief and dismay. Relief that Lily hadn't been distressed, dismay that her absence hadn't been more acutely felt. "She really is adaptable," Reeves remarked, apparently intending it as a compliment. "You've done an amazing job with her." Sarah managed a tight smile, accepting Lily back into her arms with barely concealed desperation. The baby snuggled against her familiar warmth, and for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to pretend that this was just a normal day, that the countdown clock wasn't ticking relentlessly toward September 15th. 2 weeks before the transition date, Ms. Harmon called with unexpected news. "Melissa Taylor has requested a meeting with both you and Mr. Reeves," she informed Sarah. "She's being temporarily released from jail for the meeting under supervision." Sarah was baffled. What does she want to meet about? She wouldn't say specifically, only that it concerns Lily's future, and she wants to speak with both of you together. The meeting was arranged at the sheriff's department, in the same conference room where Sarah had first met Melissa months earlier. Frank drove her there, Lily babbling happily in her car seat, unaware of the tension radiating from the adults. Jason Reeves was already there when they arrived, looking as confused by the summons as Sarah felt. Sheriff Bennett ushered them into the conference room, where Melissa waited, flanked by a corrections officer and her attorney. She looked thinner than Sarah remembered, her prison-issue clothing hanging loosely on her frame, but her eyes were clear and direct as she greeted them. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steadier than it had been during their first meeting. "I know you're both busy, and this is probably the last thing you need right now." Sarah sat down across from her, adjusting Lily on her lap. The baby stared at Melissa with innocent curiosity, too young to recognize the woman who had given her life and then nearly taken it away. "Why did you want to see us?" Reeves asked, his tone cautious but not hostile. Melissa took a deep breath. "I've been following what's happening with Lily, with the custody situation. My attorney keeps me updated." She glanced at the lawyer beside her, who nodded encouragingly. "I know I have no right to an opinion after what I did. I've given up my parental rights and I'm serving my time, but I can't stop thinking about what's best for her." Sarah felt a flicker of apprehension. Was Melissa going to try to reclaim her rights? To complicate an already impossible situation? "I was alone and terrified when I had Lily," Melissa continued, her voice dropping. "I made the worst mistake of my life that night, but now I have a chance to at least try to make one right decision for her." She looked directly at Sarah, then at Reeves. "I've watched both of you fighting over her, both wanting what's best for her in your own ways. And I keep thinking about that horse, Whisper, who somehow knew exactly where to find her, who led Mr. Miller to her when no human would have ever spotted her in time." Frank, who had been standing quietly near the door, stepped closer at the mention of Whisper. "It seems like fate or providence or something brought all of you together," Melissa said. "Mr. Reeves, you're her biological father. You have a right to know her, to be part of her life. But Ms. Miller," her voice broke slightly, "you've been her mother in every way that matters. You found her. You loved her when she was nothing but a burden and a responsibility. You saved her life just as surely as that horse did." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes, Lily heavy and warm against her chest. "What are you saying, Melissa?" Reeves asked quietly. "I'm saying that maybe there's a better solution than tearing Lily away from the only home she's known, but also better than denying her a relationship with her father." Melissa looked at her attorney, who produced a document from a folder. "I've drafted a letter to the family court judge, expressing my belief that Lily's best interests would be served by a permanent shared custody arrangement between the two of you." Sarah felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly took her breath away. "Shared custody?" "I know my opinion doesn't legally matter anymore," Melissa acknowledged. "But I thought it might help if the judge knew that Lily's biological mother believes she deserves to have both of you in her life, not as visitors or weekend parents, but as equal permanent presences." Reeves was staring at the document, his expression unreadable. "You want us to co-parent?" "Is that so crazy?" Melissa asked. "People do it all the time after divorce. You two at least respect each other, from what I can tell. You both want what's best for Lily." There was a long silence as Sarah and Reeves absorbed this unexpected proposal. Sarah looked down at Lily, who had fallen asleep against her chest, one tiny hand curled around a lock of Sarah's hair. The thought of not having to give her up completely, of still being mommy, even if she had to share that role with someone else, filled her with cautious hope. "It would be complicated," she said finally, looking up at Reeves. "We'd have to figure out a lot of details." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, we would. Living arrangements, schedules, holidays." "But it could work," Sarah pressed, unable to keep the eagerness from her voice. "Lots of children have two homes, two sets of parents who love them. And Lily deserves all the love she can get, after the way her life started." Reeves seemed to be considering the idea seriously. "I never wanted to take her away from you completely," he admitted. "I just wanted a chance to be her father. You can be her father without making me stop being her mother," Sarah said quietly. Melissa watched this exchange with a mixture of relief and sadness. "I have no right to ask anything of either of you," she said. "But please consider it, for Lily's sake." After the meeting, Sarah and Reeves agreed to discuss the possibility further with their respective attorneys before making any decisions. The hope that had kindled in Sarah's chest remained fragile but persistent as she drove home with Frank and Lily. "Do you think he'll agree?" she asked her father, glancing at Lily, sleeping peacefully in her car seat. "I think he might," Frank replied thoughtfully. "He seems like a decent man, underneath it all. And he has to see how happy and healthy Lily is with you." The next few days were filled with legal consultations and negotiations. Ms. Harmon worked tirelessly to draft a proposed shared custody agreement that would satisfy both parties and, most importantly, serve Lily's best interests. The plan would allow Lily to remain primarily at Sarah's home until her first birthday, then gradually transition to a more equal division of time between the two households. 5 days before the scheduled transition date, Sarah and Reeves met at Frank's farm, neutral territory that allowed Lily to play on a blanket in the shade while the adults talked. Whisper watched from the nearby paddock, her ears pricked forward with interest. "I've thought about it a lot," Reeves began, absently helping Lily stack plastic rings on a toy. "And I've talked it over with my mom and my attorney. I think Melissa might be right. Maybe the best thing for Lily isn't an all-or-nothing approach." Sarah held her breath, hardly daring to hope. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying I'd be willing to try shared custody, to co-parent with you." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "You're a good mother, Sarah. Lily loves you. Taking her away from you completely would hurt her, and I don't want to do that." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." "I think I do," he replied quietly. "Because I've been facing the same fear, that I'd never really get to be her father, that I'd just be some guy she visits occasionally." They spent the next hour discussing practical arrangements, how they would handle transitions, communication, major decisions about Lily's care. By the time they finished, they had the outline of a plan that felt workable, if not perfect. As Reeves prepared to leave, He paused, watching Whisper graze peacefully in the paddock. "That's her, isn't it? The horse that found Lily?" Sarah nodded. "That's Whisper. Mind if I say hello to her, since she's kind of the reason we're all here?" Frank, who had been keeping a respectful distance during their conversation, stepped forward. "Come on, I'll introduce you." He led Reeves to the fence, calling softly to Whisper, who approached with her characteristic gentle curiosity. Reeves reached out tentatively to stroke her neck, clearly unfamiliar with horses but willing to overcome his hesitation. "Thank you," he said simply, addressing the mare directly. "For finding her. For saving her." Whisper nickered softly, pushing her nose against his hand in what seemed almost like acknowledgement. Sarah, watching from the blanket with Lily in her lap, felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle that had begun with Whisper's discovery was finally closing. 2 days later, they appeared before Judge Wilson with their proposed shared custody agreement. The judge reviewed it carefully, asking probing questions about logistics and contingency plans, before finally nodding her approval. "It's refreshing to see two parties put aside their differences for the well-being of a child," she remarked, signing the order that would make their agreement legally binding. "And quite remarkable to consider the journey that brought you to this point." As they left the courthouse, the September sun warm on their faces, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. Lily would still spend half her time with Reeves eventually, but the transition would be gradual, respectful of her developmental needs and attachments. Most importantly, Sarah would remain mommy, a permanent, essential presence in Lily's life. "We should celebrate," Frank suggested as they walked to the parking lot. "How about a picnic at the farm? Jason, you're welcome to join us." Reeves hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that, if Sarah's okay with it." "I am," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "I think it's a good idea for Lily to see us all getting along." They drove separately to the farm, where Frank had prepared a simple lunch of sandwiches and lemonade. They ate at the picnic table near the paddock, Lily happily babbling in a portable high chair between Sarah and Reeves. Whisper grazed nearby, occasionally wandering over to the fence to observe their impromptu celebration. As the afternoon waned, Reeves prepared to leave for his evening shift at the construction site. "Same time on Saturday?" he confirmed, referring to their newly established visitation schedule. Sarah nodded. "We'll be ready, and I'll text you if anything changes with her routine before then." After he had gone, Sarah and Frank sat in companionable silence, watching Lily play with a set of plastic keys on the blanket. The weight of impending loss that had pressed on Sarah for months had lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism about this new arrangement. "Do you think it will work?" she asked her father. "Really work, long term?" Frank considered the question, his gaze drifting to Whisper, who had settled near the fence as if keeping watch over them. "I think it has a chance," he said finally. "And sometimes, a chance is all you need." Sarah smiled, lifting Lily into her arms and pressing a kiss to her soft head. "A chance is all we needed that night, wasn't it? When Whisper found you in that ditch." She walked over to the fence, Lily secure in her arms, and reached out to stroke Whisper's velvety nose. "Thank you," she murmured to the mare, echoing Reeves's words from earlier. "For everything." Whisper nickered softly, her dark eyes seeming to reflect understanding beyond what should be possible for a horse. In that moment, Sarah felt a certainty that transcended logical explanation. This gentle mare had changed the course of not just Lily's life, but all of theirs, through some instinct or awareness that defied conventional understanding. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the farm, Sarah held Lily close, breathing in her sweet baby scent. Whatever challenges lay ahead in their unconventional family arrangement, whatever adjustments they all would need to make, one thing was certain: Lily would be loved, completely and unconditionally, by a circle of people brought together by the most unlikely of circumstances, and by a horse who had somehow known exactly where to find a tiny life discarded but destined for so much more. 5 years passed, flowing by like water in a stream, sometimes calm and gentle, other times turbulent and challenging, but always moving forward, carrying them all along its current. The shared custody arrangement that had begun as a fragile compromise had solidified into a functional, if occasionally complicated, family structure. Lily, now a bright-eyed kindergartner with her mother's dark hair and her father's determined chin, moved between her two homes with the adaptability of a child who had never known any other arrangement. Sarah had returned to teaching full-time when Lily turned 2, finding renewed purpose in her career while balancing the demands of motherhood. The nursery in her house had evolved into a big girl room with a butterfly-themed bedspread and bookshelves overflowing with stories. Jason, who now insisted everyone call him JT, had been promoted to foreman at his construction company and had recently purchased a small house with a backyard where Lily could play. Frank, now in his mid-60s, had semi-retired from active farming, leasing most of his acreage to a neighboring family while keeping the house and barn for himself and Whisper, who at 14 was showing signs of age but remained as gentle and intuitive as ever. The farm had become a central gathering place for their unconventional family, a neutral territory where Lily could enjoy the company of all her parents at once, without the complications of territory or ownership. It was on a warm September afternoon, almost exactly 5 years after the custody agreement had been signed, that they gathered at the farm to celebrate Lily's 5th birthday. Sarah arrived early to help Frank set up tables and decorations in the yard, while JT was responsible for bringing the cake from the bakery in town. Lily, dressed in her favorite yellow sundress with butterfly clips in her hair, darted between the house and barn, too excited to stay in one place for long. "Grandpa, can I give Whisper some carrots?" she called, already halfway to the vegetable garden where Frank grew produce for family consumption. "Just a few, Lilybug," he cautioned. "Remember, horses need to watch their sugar intake too." Sarah smiled, watching her daughter carefully select the smallest, sweetest carrots from the garden bed. Lily's relationship with Whisper had developed into something special over the years. The horse seemed to recognize the child she had rescued, showing a patience and gentleness with Lily that surpassed even her usual good temperament. And Lily, for her part, had grown up hearing the story of how Whisper had found her when she was a baby, a tale that had taken on the quality of family legend, recounted at bedtimes and family gatherings with equal parts wonder and gratitude. "She's getting so big," Frank remarked, standing beside his daughter as they watched Lily carefully feeding Whisper, her small hand flat as she'd been taught, the mare delicately accepting each offering. "Hard to believe she was ever that tiny bundle we found in the trash." Sarah nodded, a familiar ache squeezing her heart at the memory. "Sometimes I still have nightmares about it, about what would have happened if Whisper hadn't found her." "But she did," Frank reminded her gently. "That's what matters." JT arrived with the cake, an elaborate creation featuring a horse that bore a striking resemblance to Whisper. He had embraced Lily's fascination with horses wholeheartedly, even taking riding lessons himself so that he could share that interest with his daughter. "Sorry I'm late," he apologized, setting the cake carefully on the picnic table. Traffic was crazy coming out of town. Sarah waved away his apology, helping him unload packages from his truck. Over the years, they had developed a comfortable co-parenting relationship, built on mutual respect and a shared devotion to Lily. There had been rough patches, disagreements about discipline, schedule conflicts, the occasional flare of jealousy when Lily seemed to prefer one household over the other, but they had worked through each challenge with the understanding that their daughter's well-being came first. "Did you remember the ice cream?" she asked, peering into the cooler he had brought. "Vanilla and chocolate," he confirmed. "And those rainbow sprinkles she likes." More guests began to arrive. Classmates from Lily's kindergarten class with their parents, neighbors from both Sarah's and JT's neighborhoods, colleagues from the school where Sarah taught. The farm filled with the sounds of children's laughter and adult conversation, a joyful cacophony that made Frank smile as he supervised the pony rides he had arranged as a special treat. Whisper, too old now for carrying riders, watched from her paddock as the gentle Shetland pony named Biscuit carried squealing children in circles around the yard. Lily, having already had her turn, stood by the fence talking earnestly to Whisper, as if the mare could understand every word. "And then we're having cake, and then presents, and then maybe a scavenger hunt if it doesn't rain," she was explaining, standing on the bottom rail of the fence to reach Whisper's neck. "Grandpa says you can have a special apple treat later because it's a party." Sarah approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt this tender moment. "What are you and Whisper talking about, sweetheart?" Lily turned, her face alight with excitement. "I was telling her about my party, and about how she's the most special horse in the whole world, because she found me when I was a baby." "She certainly is special," Sarah agreed, running a hand along Whisper's neck. The mare leaned into the touch, her eyes half closing in contentment. "Mommy, is it true that if Whisper hadn't found me, I might have died?" Lily asked suddenly, her expression solemn. Sarah hesitated, always careful about how much of the story to share with Lily at each stage of her development. They had never hidden the circumstances of her birth and rescue from her, believing that honesty, appropriately filtered for age, was the best approach. But they had focused more on the miracle of her being found than on the darker aspects of her abandonment. "Yes, that's true," she answered finally. "You were very small, and it was cold that night. Whisper knew you needed help, and she made sure Grandpa found you." Lily nodded, processing this information with the straightforward acceptance of a child. "Then she saved my life. Like a hero." "Exactly like a hero," Sarah confirmed, her throat tightening with emotion. "Is that why I have 2 houses and most kids only have 1? Lily continued, connecting dots in the way children often did, jumping from one thought to another with an internal logic all their own. Sarah crouched down to eye level with her daughter. "That's part of it. Your story is special, Lily. And because of that, your family is special too. You have me and your daddy and Grandpa and Whisper, all loving you very much." Lily seemed satisfied with this explanation, her attention already shifting to the sight of her friends gathered around the picnic table where Frank was organizing a game. "Can I go play, Mommy?" "Of course, sweetheart. It's your party." As Lily darted off to join her friends, JT approached, having overheard part of the conversation. "She's asking more questions," he observed. Sarah nodded. "She's trying to make sense of her story. It's natural." "We've been talking about when to tell her more about Melissa," JT said, keeping his voice low. "She's going to ask eventually." Melissa Taylor had served her sentence and been released 3 years earlier. True to her word, she had used the trust fund Sarah established to enroll in community college, where she was studying social work with the goal of helping other young women in crisis. She had maintained a respectful distance from Lily's life, receiving occasional updates and photographs through Sarah, but never attempting to insert herself into the child's world. "I think we wait until she asks directly," Sarah replied after a moment's thought. "She knows she grew in another woman's tummy, like we explained when my cousin had her baby. When she wants to know more about that woman, we'll tell her in an age-appropriate way." JT nodded in agreement. Over the years, he had come to appreciate Sarah's thoughtful approach to parenting, just as she had come to value his playful energy and steadfast reliability. They made a good team, their different strengths complementing each other in Lily's upbringing. The birthday party continued with cake and presents, Lily's face glowing with delight as she blew out the candles and tore into carefully wrapped packages. There were books and art supplies from Sarah, a beginner's riding helmet and boots from JT, and from Frank, a handmade wooden rocking horse painted to resemble Whisper, complete with a flowing mane and tail made from real horsehair. "Grandpa, it looks just like her," Lily exclaimed, throwing her arms around Frank's neck in an exuberant hug. "I love it so much." "I thought you might," he said with a wink. "Now you can have Whisper at both your houses." As the party wound down and guests began to depart, a light rain started to fall, sending everyone scurrying to gather presents and leftover food. Frank invited them all to stay for dinner, but Sarah and JT had already arranged for Lily to spend the night at Sarah's, as it was a school night. "Next weekend is your time," Sarah reminded JT as they loaded Lily's gifts into their respective vehicles. "Unless you have that work conference." "Conference got postponed," he replied. "So I'll pick her up from school on Friday as usual." Their co-parenting routine had become so established that these exchanges happened with minimal friction now, a far cry from the tense negotiations of the early days. Lily, accustomed to the rhythm of moving between households, rarely showed any anxiety about the transitions. Before they left, Lily insisted on saying goodbye to Whisper, who had been moved into her stall to escape the rain. Frank lifted her up to see over the half door, and the child stroked the mare's soft nose with gentle fingers. "Bye, Whisper. Thank you for my birthday party and for finding me when I was a baby," she said solemnly. "I love you." The mare nickered softly, as if returning the sentiment, and gently nuzzled Lily's small hand. Frank set the child down, and she skipped off to Sarah's car, birthday energy still propelling her despite the long, exciting day. As Sarah buckled Lily into her booster seat, she glanced back at the barn where Frank stood in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the warm light from within. Beside him, just visible in the stall, was Whisper's distinctive profile. The sight struck her with sudden poignancy, her father and the horse who had changed all their lives, standing watch as another year marked Lily's remarkable journey from abandoned newborn to vibrant child. Later that night, after Lily had finally settled into sleep surrounded by her new presents, Sarah sat on her porch with a cup of tea, listening to the gentle patter of rain on the roof. Her phone buzzed with a text from JT. "Great party today. Frank outdid himself with that rocking horse." She smiled, typing back, "He's been working on it for months in secret. Did you see her face when she opened it?" "Priceless," came the reply. "We're lucky, you know. All of us." Sarah stared at those words for a long moment, feeling their truth deep in her bones. They were lucky. Lucky that Whisper had found Lily. Lucky that Frank had followed his horse that night. Lucky that they had all eventually found a way to put Lily's needs above their own desires and grievances. "We are," she texted back. Whisper knew what she was doing. She could almost see JT's smile as he replied, "That horse is smarter than most people I know." Sarah finished her tea and went inside, pausing at Lily's doorway to check on her daughter one more time. The child slept peacefully, one arm thrown around the stuffed horse that had been her constant companion since infancy, her dark hair spread across the pillow. In the soft glow of the nightlight, Sarah could see traces of both JT and Melissa in her features, genes expressing themselves in the curve of her cheek, the shape of her eyes. But Sarah also saw herself reflected in Lily, not in physical resemblance, but in the child's determination, her compassion, her curiosity about the world. These were qualities Sarah had nurtured in her daughter through 5 years of bedtime stories and skinned knees, of anxious nights with fevers and joyful afternoons in the sunshine. Biology had not made her Lily's mother. Love and choice and circumstance had done that. As she quietly closed Lily's door, Sarah thought of Whisper, whose inexplicable behavior on a cold spring night had set this entire story in motion. Scientists might explain it as heightened animal senses, an ability to detect the scent or sound of a human infant from a distance. But Sarah preferred to believe in something more profound, a connection between living beings that transcended easy explanation, a recognition of need that had compelled the mare to act. Whatever had guided Whisper that night, the result was sleeping peacefully down the hall. A child who had begun life discarded like trash, but who was now cherished beyond measure, the center of a family circle that had formed in the most unexpected of ways. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean, nourishing the earth for new growth. Inside, Sarah moved through her quiet house with a heart full of gratitude for second chances, for horses with mysterious intuition, for fathers who listened to their animals, and for the resilient spirit of a little girl who had survived against all odds to bring healing and joy to everyone whose life she touched. In the morning, Lily would wake up asking for pancakes with rainbow sprinkles. She would chatter about her birthday party on the drive to school, would draw pictures of Whisper during art time, would navigate the complex social world of kindergarten with her characteristic blend of sensitivity and confidence. And Sarah would watch her daughter grow, day by day, marveling at the miracle that had brought them together. A miracle that began with a horse who refused to ignore a tiny cry in the darkness, who understood somehow that what had been thrown away was actually a treasure beyond price.